The summer sun blazed over the arid landscape of Texas, its heat rising from the ground in waves, distorting the horizon. It is August 1944, and the war in Europe has reached its zenith. The Allied forces are pushing through France, slowly grinding down the German defense. Across the Atlantic, the United States is gearing up for the next phase of their campaign, preparing for what would become the final assault on the Axis powers. Yet, amid the chaos of war, something extraordinary is unfolding in the small, rural town of San Antonio, Texas, where a group of German women prisoners of war is about to experience something that would shake their understanding of the world they had known. Captured in a raid not far from the front lines, the women had been brought to the U.S. as part of a larger group of prisoners. They were used to the harshness of wartime captivity, the barbed wire, the rigid discipline, and the endless uncertainty of what would come next. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to experience in the heart of Texas. These were women who had been part of the wartime medical corps, nurses and doctors, trained to care for the wounded soldiers of the Reich. They had seen the worst of the war, the brutality, the suffering, the broken bodies, and yet, they had never known what it meant to be treated as human beings by their enemies. Until now, as the prisoners were ushered into the makeshift detention center in San Antonio, they were given a glimpse of something unexpected, a meal. A meal unlike anything they had ever seen, let alone tasted. For the German women, the idea of an enemy providing them with food seemed almost preposterous. They had been taught that the Allies, especially the Americans, were cold-hearted and ruthless, offering nothing but starvation and punishment to those captured in battle. The Germans had long thought of the United States as the enemy, arrogant, self-righteous, and focused solely on defeating the Axis at any cost. But the meal they were about to be served would shatter these assumptions that it began as an ordinary afternoon. The women were led into a large, open-air courtyard where several large mesquite grills were already smoking, the air thick with the scent of charred wood and sizzling meat. The Americans, who were responsible for their care, appeared as stoic as ever, their faces impassive as they set about preparing the food. But for the German prisoners, the scene before them was anything but ordinary. They were used to rationed, bland meals, watery soups, thin bread, and the occasional piece of stale meat. But what they saw now, sizzling over the mesquite fire, was a sight that none of them could have anticipated: large, juicy T-bone steaks, thick and dripping with flavor, being slowly turned over the fire. The smell was intoxicating. For the first time in years, the German women could smell something other than the damp, musty stench of captivity. The sizzling of the meat over the hot coals was like music to their ears. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of something they could not yet fully comprehend. To many of them, the very idea of sitting down to eat something so extravagant, something so clearly reserved for the privileged few, felt like a cruel joke. They had heard of the decadence of the United States, of the wealth and abundance that flowed across the country, but this was a different kind of luxury. This was the luxury of choice, of comfort, of the freedom to savor a meal without fear as the steaks cooked. The women couldn't help but exchange glances. Some of them were unsure of what to make of the situation. They had been treated with a level of care in the U.S. that was already starting to unsettle their preconceived notions of their enemies. But this was beyond anything they could have expected. Could this be real? Were they truly being given the opportunity to enjoy a meal that was beyond anything they had tasted in years? One of the women, a nurse named Greta, couldn't take her eyes off the T-bone steaks. She had been through the war's darkest moments, including the air raids over Berlin, the harrowing medical evacuations, and the endless suffering she had witnessed as a field nurse. But now, in this strange, sun-scorched land, she found herself on the receiving end of an unexpected kindness. She watched, transfixed, as one of the American soldiers expertly flipped the steaks, the juices dripping onto the hot coals with a satisfying hiss. When the steaks were finally served, they were accompanied by an array of sides: creamy mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and a crisp salad. The presentation alone was enough to take the German women by surprise. The food was more than just sustenance. It was an experience. The flavors were rich, and the texture of the meat was tender and juicy, unlike anything they had ever tasted before. It melted in their mouths, the smoky mesquite flavor mingling with the charred edges, creating an explosion of taste that seemed impossible. It was, in every way, a luxury they had not known in the war, a luxury that none of them had ever anticipated receiving from their captors. Greta, who had once prided herself on her ability to control her emotions, found herself choking back tears as she took the first bite. She had never been given such a gift in her life. The bitterness of the war, the loss of comrades, the suffering of the people, all of it seemed to melt away in that moment. She chewed slowly, savoring each bite, the heat of the Texas sun beating down on her as the taste of the steak lingered in her mouth. Her fellow nurses shared similar reactions, their faces softening as they dug into the food. Some of them looked at each other in disbelief, unable to fully process what was happening. They had expected the worst from the Americans, perhaps a meager meal, a quick and tasteless offering, or a reminder of their captor's power. But instead, they were given something far more powerful, a moment of humanity. For the first time in the war, they were not seen as enemy combatants. They were simply human beings, sharing a meal with others who had been taught to despise them. As they ate, they spoke quietly among themselves. Some of the women whispered about their families back home. Others discussed their experiences as part of the medical corps, but most of their conversations were focused on the meal itself. Greta overheard one of her fellow nurses remark that the T-bone steaks melted in your mouth. It wasn't just a comment on the quality of the food. It was a reflection of the bizarre reality they found themselves in. These women had been trained to endure hardship, to accept the unthinkable, but this kindness, this unexpected luxury, was too much to comprehend. The meal would not erase the suffering they had experienced or the brutalities of the war. It would not undo the loss of comrades or the atrocities they had witnessed. But for that brief moment, sitting together under the scorching Texas sun, the German nurses experienced something more profound than a meal. They experienced a glimpse of what humanity could be at its best, a brief but powerful reminder that even in the most dire of circumstances, kindness could transcend the battlefront. And for the first time in years, the German nurses could taste something other than war. They could taste peace. However fleeting it might be, as the days went by. The unexpected kindness the German women POWs received in the Texas detention center began to shape their perspectives in profound ways. The lingering taste of the Mesquite-Grilled T-bone steak, the richness of the flavors, the unexpected warmth of the American hospitality, each moment contributed to a deep internal reckoning. For the women, who had lived through the horrors of war, this experience served as a moment of cognitive dissonance. The American soldiers, whom they had been taught to despise and fear, had not only shown them mercy but had done so in the most personal and visceral way imaginable, through the act of sharing food. Greta, the nurse who had been so moved by the T-bone steak, found herself wrestling with this strange new reality. She had always viewed the Americans as the enemy, the very people responsible for the war that had cost so many lives. Yet, here she was, sitting with them, eating food prepared by their hands, sharing in the same experience as her captors. She had spent years tending to the wounded in field hospitals under the Nazi regime, where the wounded soldiers were treated based on their rank or importance to the war effort. But this was different. Here, there was no hierarchy. There was no distinction between the victor and the vanquished. There was just shared humanity. Her fellow prisoners, too, were struggling with the same internal conflict. Some of them, like Anna, an older nurse who had witnessed the war's darkest days in the East, found it particularly difficult to process the kindness they had received. Anna had been part of the medical teams that had treated German soldiers on the front lines of the Eastern Front, and she had seen firsthand the devastation wrought by the war. But she had also been indoctrinated into the idea that the Allies were the enemy, and as such, they were to be treated with the same animosity and suspicion that they had received from their own commanders. Yet here, in the scorching Texas heat, those same enemies were offering them not only food, but also the kind of care and compassion they had long forgotten. For Anna, the meal represented more than just a break from the usual bland rations. It was a symbolic gesture of defiance against everything she had been taught. In a strange twist of fate, it was the very people she had been taught to hate who were offering her something that, in her mind, was far more valuable than food: the possibility of redemption. Could it be that the Americans, in their own way, were showing her a path forward? Was it possible that even in the midst of war, the spirit of humanity could prevail? The kindness they experienced in the Texas camp was not limited to food. It was reflected in the overall treatment they received during their captivity. The women were not subjected to the harsh conditions that many prisoners of war endured. They were given medical attention when needed, provided with decent living quarters, and allowed to rest and recover in peace. This was a far cry from the brutal conditions they had expected in the hands of their captors. Their captors treated them with respect and dignity, a far cry from the images of American soldiers they had seen in German propaganda films. For the German women, this was a revelation. They had been trained to see the war in terms of absolute victors and vanquished, with the Allied forces as the ultimate enemy. They had been taught that there could be no reconciliation with the enemy, that the destruction of the Axis powers was the only path to peace. But now, they were faced with a starkly different reality. They had been defeated, yes, but they had not been destroyed. They had been treated with compassion, even kindness, by the very forces they had once fought against. It was a lesson they would carry with them long after the war ended. The emotional toll of this experience was not lost on the American soldiers who had cared for them. Many of the soldiers, initially tasked with guarding the prisoners, had found themselves questioning the narrative they had been fed about the Germans. These were not the faceless enemies they had been taught to hate. These were human beings who had been caught in the same storm, suffering in their own way. As the days passed, these soldiers found themselves offering not just food and care, but a sense of companionship, treating the German nurses as fellow human beings, not as enemies to be feared. This shift in perspective had profound effects on both the American soldiers and the German women POWs. The soldiers, who had been taught to see the Germans as the ultimate threat, began to see them as victims of the war, just as much as anyone else. They had spent years fighting in brutal conditions, and now, in the relative safety of a Texas detention camp, they saw the faces of the women they had been told to hate. And as they interacted with these women, they began to realize that their enemies were not so different from themselves. They too had families, dreams, and fears. They too had been caught up in the machinery of war, forced to fight a conflict they had never chosen. This realization created a strange bond between the American soldiers and the German nurses. It was not a bond forged in friendship, but in mutual understanding. They shared the same fears, the same hope for peace, and the same longing for an end to the suffering. For the German nurses, this moment of understanding was equally profound. They had always been taught that the Americans were their enemies, but now they saw that these soldiers, like themselves, were merely pawns in a much larger game. And in this moment of shared humanity, they found solace. They had been given the opportunity to taste something sweeter than the war they had fought in. A brief but powerful taste of peace as the war drew to a close and the prisoners were finally released. The German women carried with them the memories of their unexpected experience in Texas. The kindness they had received in that small corner of the world had changed them in ways they could not have imagined. They returned to Germany, forever altered by the generosity they had experienced at the hands of their former enemies. But it was not just the German prisoners who were affected. The American soldiers, too, carried the weight of this experience with them. The lessons learned in that Texas camp, of humanity in the face of war, of compassion in the midst of hatred, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The war had taught them many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this, that even in the darkest of times, when the world seems to be consumed by violence and destruction, there is always room for kindness, and so, the story of the German women POWs and the Texas Mesquite-Grilled T-bone steak serves as a testament to the enduring power of humanity, even in the face of war. It is a story of how, in the most unlikely of places, amid the harsh realities of a brutal conflict, the simplest of acts, like sharing a meal, can bridge the chasm of hatred and lead to the understanding that, in the end, we are all human. The aftermath of the German women's experiences in the Texas POW camp rippled far beyond the confines of the military detention center. As the war came to an end, these women carried with them a profound and transformative lesson that would alter the course of their lives, challenging everything they had believed about their enemies, their role in the war, and the nature of human conflict. The impact of their time in Texas was not confined to a single meal or a moment of kindness. It was a fundamental shift in how they viewed themselves, the world around them, and the American soldiers who had once been their sworn enemies. When the German nurses returned home after the war, they found themselves in a country struggling to pick up the pieces of a shattered nation. Germany, now defeated and divided, was rife with tension. The psychological and emotional scars left by the war were etched deeply into the collective memory of the people. For the women who had been in the Texas camp, the memories of their captivity and the unexpected kindness they had received stood in stark contrast to the world they returned to. They had been trained to see the war in terms of absolute destruction, to view the enemy as something less than human. But their experiences in the U.S. had shattered that worldview. They had been treated with dignity and respect by the very people they had been taught to hate. And in the quiet of their return to post-war Germany, this knowledge became both a burden and a beacon. Greta, the nurse who had been so deeply moved by the Mesquite-Grilled T-bone steak, found herself grappling with this paradox. She had witnessed the horrors of the war, had seen the broken bodies of soldiers and civilians alike, and had been part of a regime that perpetuated the very destruction that had ravaged Europe. But now, having experienced a level of care and compassion from her captors that was unimaginable, she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that her entire perception of the world had been wrong. How could she reconcile the humanity she had received with the cruelty of the war she had fought in? How could she go back to the life she had known, knowing that her captors had shown her a kindness that her own people had not? The experience of being treated as a human being by the Americans was not just a physical transformation for these nurses. It was an emotional and moral reckoning. They had spent years following orders, working within the confines of a regime that had justified the brutality of war. Now, they found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. The care they received in Texas forced them to reassess their role in the war. Were they, too, complicit in the suffering? Were they simply following orders? Or had they turned a blind eye to the atrocities that surrounded them? For some, the struggle was unbearable. The emotional cost of reconciling their past actions with the compassion they had been shown was immense. Many of the women were deeply conflicted. Could they ever return to their medical work, knowing what they had witnessed, knowing that they had been part of a system that had caused so much destruction? Greta, in particular, found herself haunted by the memory of the kindness shown to her. As a nurse, she had spent her life caring for the wounded, but she had never been given the opportunity to experience that same level of care herself. Now that she had, she found it difficult to return to a society that was still reeling from the war's aftermath. Unsure of how to integrate this new perspective into the fractured world she had come back to, for the American soldiers who had cared for these women, the experience of interacting with the German nurses had a similarly profound impact. The act of showing kindness to the enemy, of offering them food, shelter, and medical care, was something that had never been part of their training. They had been taught to see the Germans as the enemy, to view them with suspicion and hatred. But as the days passed, as they spoke with the German nurses and shared meals with them, they began to see something they had never considered, that the Germans, like them, were simply human beings caught in a larger, tragic conflict. For many of the soldiers, the experience of treating the German prisoners of war was a turning point. It forced them to confront the moral ambiguities of war, the fact that both sides were equally capable of suffering, of fear, and of pain. The soldiers, who had once been trained to view the Germans as less than human, began to see them as fellow human beings, as victims of a war that had consumed them all. For some, this realization was difficult to accept. How could they reconcile the kindness they had shown their enemies with the brutality of the war they had fought in? But in the end, this act of humanity, the simple act of sharing a meal, became a powerful symbol of the possibility of peace and reconciliation in a world torn apart by violence. As the war ended and the German nurses returned home, the American soldiers were left to reflect on the experience. Many of them would carry the memory of those days in the Texas camp for the rest of their lives. The women they had once viewed as enemies had become symbols of something greater: the resilience of the human spirit, the possibility of compassion even in the darkest of times. For the soldiers, the experience had shattered their preconceived notions about the enemy, forcing them to confront the complexities of war and the blurred lines between good and evil. And for the German women, the kindness they had received would forever alter their understanding of humanity. They had been shown that even in the most brutal of wars, there could still be room for compassion. That even enemies could share in moments of humanity, in the years that followed. Both the American soldiers and the German nurses would go on to live their lives, each carrying with them the lessons of their time in Texas. For some, it would be a quiet reflection, a memory of a strange and unexpected moment of peace in the midst of a violent conflict. For others, it would be a turning point, a moment that forced them to reevaluate their beliefs, their actions, and their understanding of the world. But in the end, the story of the German women POWs and the Mesquite-Grilled T-bone steaks would remain a powerful testament to the ability of humanity to find common ground, even in the most unlikely of places. It was a reminder that, in the end, even in the most brutal of wars, there was always the possibility for kindness, for compassion, and for the simple, profound act of sharing a meal.